did the UN Global Compact's Leader Summit, and there was this quote, one of the speakers, and I cannot remember his name, but he said this: "It's about building a pie that is more inclusive and more sustainable and doesn't leave anyone behind." And I just wanted to say that because that to me fundamentally speaks to who we are at the UN Global Compact. It was set up about 20 years ago under Kofi Annan. There's a little quote there on the slide that I've included. But basically, it came at a time when people felt we needed businesses to come to the party, to join the narrative and operate more responsibly, more sustainably, more ethically. Not taking away from those that weren't already doing that, but really bringing about a set of step changes and transformation that meant that we could, as a collective, have more weight to getting to where we wanted to be. And so within the UN Global Compact, we're really aligned to these 10 principles that you may have heard. And they're sort of bucketed into 4 main areas around anti-corruption, human rights, labor rights, and the environment. And then when the Sustainable Development Goals came into play in 2015, we then added that, I guess, to our arsenal of areas and tools that we were working on to better support companies globally achieve a certain number of different, areas. So globally, we now have just over 10,500 companies that have joined, and we have around 3,500 non-businesses join as well. And so by that, I mean academic institutions, civil society, and unions. And collectively, we're working towards those 10 principles. Now, in the next slide, I think it's around the GCNA. So the Global Compact Network Australia, the way in which the UN Global Compact effectively operationalizes the work that they do, the way in which they're able to bring together signatories to the UN is through its networks. So we operate in around, I think, 70 countries. And within Australia, the sort of role that we have is contextualizing those 4 broad areas. And so within the environment space, for instance, we are very focused on the Science-Based Target Initiative around just transition. So what does it mean to transition to a net zero carbon economy, for instance? In human rights, we have a strong focus on the Modern Slavery Act because obviously that came through. So we spend a lot of time working with our members because we are membership based, but looking at what are the different types of streams that we can work on to better support the achievement of those principles in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's kind of us in a nutshell. I won't go into more detail. It kind of gives you a bit of a brief understanding of who we are. And if you want to know more, please feel free to go to our website, because I'm pretty sure our comms person asked me to say that. But that's kind of who we are in a nutshell. But I think where you've come to this webinar is to really understand more around the Science-Based Target Initiative. So I'm just going to skip ahead to, I think it's slide 6, where there's sort of I think there's an image of a bushfire. So we already know that we are experiencing the effects of climate change. I'm just going to give you a sort of a broad background of why a science-based target initiative, or why setting a science-based target makes particular sense at this point in time. So we've seen the effects. We've seen a lot of the headlines. I don't think a month goes by without me hearing the words unprecedented heat wave, or unprecedented drought, or unprecedented flooding. These are things that are kind of becoming part of the discourse. And we've seen the types of events over the last year, whether it be the wildfires of the Amazon, or the record flooding and rainfall in Brazil, or the heat waves in the UK, and of course the bushfires in Australia. Now, I don't want to get down to the attributional science component, but what preceded those bushfires were unprecedented drought and heat waves. And those conditions meant that we were far more likely to see the level of bushfires that we saw across Australia. And I think it's important to note that at this point in time, that really is becoming the new normal. That isn't just a one-off event that we can say we're not going to see again for another 20 years. We're starting to see these once-in-a-lifetime types of events occur more frequently and with more intensity in some cases, depending on where you're coming from. And so in addition to that, we're also starting to understand that there are temperature increases. So you've probably heard that the sort of 1.5 or the 2 degree threshold. And that's because at the moment we're standing at about 1.2, I believe, from the data. And so we're inching our way quite close to this 1.5, which is really what we would like to stay within. And I think it's also important to note that these hot events, so 2019 was one of the hottest years on record. The month of January 2020 in Australia was one of the hottest months on record. 2020 data is showing us that this will probably end up becoming one of the hottest years on record. So we're starting to see this upward trend, and I didn't add a graph because I don't think you need to see the graph, but we're really starting to see this sort of hockey stick understanding of things are going in the upward trend, which is probably not where we want to be. So from a surface temperature perspective, we're really starting to increase. And I'm only talking about that because knowing where we sit from a temperature perspective and why we're setting these thresholds where we are, it's critical to then understand as a business, why are we aiming towards that 1.5, well below 2 degree perspective. So the next slide that I wanted to go to talk about is really around the Paris Agreement. So we have this sort of broad climate change perspective. We know that the science is robust. We've probably read or seen the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change special report at 1.5 degrees. We've seen the headlines. We know what's happening. But then from a policy perspective, we then have the Paris Agreement, which was agreed upon back in 2015. At the time, I was at Save the Children, and to me, it was a monumental piece of negotiations, to be honest. I have been to countless conference of parties. These are the yearly climate change negotiations. And for that many countries, so it's 195 governments, to come together and agree to language of well below 2 degrees and 1.5, to me was incredible. And it was incredible because I had been working with some of the Pacific Islands in the lead up to that for years. And I'd sort of been in one of the groups, and they were desperately asking for us to go to 1.5 or below, because anything above that, if you're a low-lying state or a Pacific Island country, is disastrous. So that Paris Agreement kind of sets up the framing of where we are from a, I guess, globally, where countries are potentially positioning themselves. So then the next slide, and I couldn't help myself, there is a graph, so there are some numbers, so I'm really sorry about that. But I do think it's important, and that kind of gives you an idea of where we are and where we're wanting to get to. So very simply put, it's not a very difficult graph because I'm just not that well inclined, but basically what it says is, in an ideal world, and what we're hearing right now is we want to be below that 2 degree threshold. At the moment, we've got pledges. So this is your INDC, which is your intended nationally determined contribution, sorry. That's what your governments globally, they have each put in what they think they would like to get to, so their targets. When you add all of that up in very fancy computing, you kind of get to that 2.5, 2.8 kind of area, which is above where we ideally want to be. And then above that, if you look at that 3.3, 3.9, that's kind of the sort of current policy landscape. And then anything above that is just terrible. But anything above that, so when you start thinking about your business as usual approach, so if we were to just stay the course, you don't set a target, Australia decides from a federal level it doesn't really want to do anything, and you think about where we are globally, then we're starting to look at your 3, your 4, your 5 degree. Given that we're already at 1.2 and we're already seeing some of those physical impacts, we probably don't want to get above the 2 degrees. So this is why the Science Based Target Initiative, and I'll sort of go into the origins, that's kind of why it started to emerge, because businesses were already starting to ask the question, can we even operate up anything above 2? And I remember some of the largest insurers saying, and this was a couple of years ago, anything above 3 degrees is uninsurable. So this one I stole from Alex Farsan, and he is a global lead of the Science Based Target Initiative from WWF, and he came over last year and ran 2 of our workshops on the Science Based Target Initiative, and he's just an encyclopedia. But one of I stole this slide because A, I liked it, but B, I think it shows the sort of pace of change. Excuse me. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is, so it's 5th Avenue, it's horse-drawn carriages, and there's only one car. So that little circle in red is the one car of the image. And then you fast forward to 1913, so just a 13-year period, and that same space, it's all cars. And so I just use it as an anecdote to demonstrate the level of change that you can see in a very rapid time frame. And I think when you're thinking about COVID-19, for instance, and you think about how quickly we were able to pivot, how quickly our government, and this is globally, were able to use scientific data to make very quick policy decisions, we know that we actually have the mechanisms, the frameworks to make very quick decisions based on scientific evidence. And yes, it's probably more complex than that, but at a basic level, we know that we can change very quickly. We also know that a lot of the innovations and solutions and technologies actually already exist. So we can actually change very, very quickly. So the next 3 slides are 3 major businesses. So your first one, IKEA, household name, Swedish company. I've been there many times, probably almost divorced my husband about 10 times, lost my 4-year-old child, very famous. But they have set a target of reducing life cycle emissions for the average product by 70% by 2030. I think also interestingly to that little sort of target, all of their CEOs are now also called Chief Sustainability Officers. And I just bring that in as a little anecdote because I didn't realize that until I met the CEO of Australia. It's interesting because the way in which sustainability is infused into everything that they do is really interesting as a way of working. And having now worked at the GCNA for 18 months, I've seen how sustainability professionals are often sidelined. Not always, but I think it becomes really critical that the sustainability function really become immersive in the whole business and as part of the culture, because then it really helps you to when you're setting those targets, to really have those conversations that need to be had across a number of different stakeholders within an organization. The next one is Levi's, I believe. And of course, that's an American clothing company. I think a lot of us may have had a pair of 501s at one stage in our lives. They set their target to reduce direct emissions by 90% and value chain emissions by 40% by 2025. So again, quite ambitious, really interesting model, and definitely something to think about when you're sort of thinking about all of the different companies, of which there are close to 900 now that have set targets. Some of them have really complex models. So thinking about where they're setting themselves globally and what are some of the things that we can learn in Australia and how we can apply that to our own business models here. The third example is Carlsberg. So this is a Danish brewing company, and they aim to achieve 0 carbon emissions across all of its breweries by 2030. So these are the types of announcements, these are the types of targets that we're starting to see taking place. So now the next slide really is around, well, what is the Science-Based Target Initiative? I've kind of been speaking around it, talking about numbers and temperatures and climate change impact and seeing the physical impacts. So there's a real logical rationale for why we would have an initiative of this nature. And I think it was Alex last year that really compared setting a target to those INDCs. So the INDC, that intended nationally determined contribution, is the sort of government space, but the science-based target is the business space. And I think in my mind, that really made a lot of sense because it shows the power and the role that you have as a business and the weight that businesses can have in actually supporting governments reach their targets, because fundamentally you can't do it without one another. So the Science-Based Target Initiative was launched in around 2014. And I thought it was 2015, but I was able to interview Alex a week and a half ago for a podcast, and he reminded me of the actual date. But it came at a time when carbon footprinting was taking place. Businesses were starting to think about how to account for their emissions. They were really thinking and talking about their scope 1 and their scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And there were a lot of questions that were percolating. But in tandem to that, there was also this realization that they didn't want to be considered to be greenwashing either. So the big question was, well, what can we do as a business to show that we're serious about this and not get sort of pulled up in, by media or by other businesses that we're just not doing enough? We need, I guess, an external party to verify and validate the fact that we're serious about this type of target setting. And so the Science-Based Target Initiative was born, and it was born as a result of 4 main parties. So we have the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is known as CDP, the UN Global Compact, the World Resources Institute, which I might refer to as WRI later on, and WWF. And these four parties collectively came together and launched the Science Based Target Initiative. So that's sort of, I guess, a basic understanding of why these conversations were taking place. And then, of course, you had the Paris Agreement that further set the tone around the 2 degree and well below 2 degrees. And now we're really probably more working towards a 1.5 degree target for a lot of businesses. So I often get asked when I'm in meetings, you know, why would I do this? I mean, from my perspective, I come from climate change, so to me it's a sort of course you would set a target. Why would you want to not play a role in reducing carbon emissions? But obviously there have to be other reasons. There has to be a clear rationale, and here I've listed 6 of them. This is taken from the website, but really it comes down to a few things. So yes, we've seen the physical impacts. Yes, we know what's happening from a temperature perspective. You know, all of that is reasonably clear, but we're also starting to get some pretty big questions coming from investors. You know, the likes of BlackRock and others are starting to ask really pointed questions to some of these companies. And these questions aren't going to go away. And then you have other things like the TCFD. You have a number of different sort of voluntold mechanisms that are such that at the board level, they're also starting to ask questions. There's a lot more conversation in that disclosure piece and around that risk piece. And so I think all of these different questions are such that companies are starting to think, what do we need to do to demonstrate to our investors and to others that we take things really seriously? And I attended a conference last year, and I think it was the IGCC, so the Investor Group on Climate Change. And some of the investor groups were saying, we will pay more attention and we will spend, we have more, I guess, trust in, I'm not sure that's the word they use, but more trust in companies that have a strong transition plan to net zero than those companies that don't, even if that company is a high emitting company as it stands. And so the science-based target and setting of that is one way of very clearly signaling to your investor that you take the, I guess, the transition in one sense very seriously. You know that we're kind of, all of the data is, I guess, showing us that we're moving in that direction, that by 2050, we will hopefully be at a net zero carbon type scenario. So I think that's really important. Then, of course, you've got things like employees asking for it. You've then got, you know, savings. You've got the innovations that might come out of you setting a target. You've got reputation. Reputation is a really big thing for a lot of companies. And you've also just got, you know, CEOs wanting to be even more courageous. And this is one way of showing, like, yes, I know what climate change is. I know what's happening. And I know that this is potentially one way of doing that, of showing my concrete understanding of what I can do from a mechanical perspective, I guess, in one sense, of getting there. And I'm sure we'll hear more from Peter when he talks about Australia Post and the sort of pathways that they went down. So next slide is around the carbon budget. Now, I won't go into a huge amount of depth here, but basically we have a carbon budget. So it's a global carbon budget. And effectively we have probably, I'm not sure if burning our way through is the right term, but we've basically gotten to about 2/3 of the way to our global carbon budget. And it's just, I'm just showing these pictures because I think it's just important to note that there's a threshold here that we don't want to go over. So we don't want to overshoot the global carbon budget. And please don't ask me how you calculate this, because I'm not a technical person, but I know that it's there. I know that we have our share within the global carbon budget. I know that the more carbon dioxide we throw up into the atmosphere, the closer we get to that threshold. So in one sense, by setting your science-based target, you are enabling us globally to not overshoot. And so if you think back to that slide that I had previously with the temperature rise, what we don't want to do is get to that anything above 2, 3, 4, 5 space, because we don't really know what that means. And as scientists, it's really hard to understand what that might really concretely look like. So this is just to say that as a company, you need to understand the global carbon budget. You need to understand what your contribution is to that and what you can do to then reduce it in one sense. And then the next slide is really the process. So once you've decided as a company, you've had the conversations, you obviously understand that this is something that probably needs to happen. You then have this science-based target initiative that comes with a number of different steps. And so your first step is just the commitment level. And so by committing, you're indicating that your company will work to setting a science-based emissions reduction target. And that comes in the form of a letter. It's relatively straightforward. You then upload that, and then you're listed as committed. So the process of delivering that letter is very easy. The thinking and the conversations that need to happen as a result of that are obviously far more complicated. And then you have a series of other processes. So you have to develop, submit, and announce. You then have a 2-year period. I'll make this really short. You just have a 2-year period within that. So from commitment to when you then submit, you then have that 2-year period. So you also don't need to have all of the answers. You can say that you're committed and not necessarily know how you're going to get there. And I think that's really critical, because a lot of businesses are worried that they don't necessarily have all of the tools in hand. And I'm going to hand over to Jonas now, because that is why you have organizations like Edge Environment that you can then go to, and I'm doing a really great plug for you, Jonas, that you can then go to say, I don't really know what I'm doing. How can you then help me in that 2-year period get to where we need to be? And knowing that an organization like Edge has also gone through that process themselves. So they're in a really good position because they've gone through it. They've had to work through it with their own team to know how to get there. And I've just left, this is my last slide, I promise I'll stop talking, but we have, actually that number is incorrect, but we have close to 900 companies globally that have set their targets. And in Australia, we have around 23. And these are just companies that are on the website. And these are companies that are taking this very seriously. So we have seen a really strong shift and an increase across Australia in the number of companies that are moving in that direction. And I'm done. Thank you.
Corinne, thank you very much. I'm just going to move through those last couple of slides there. There's a bit of information there on how you can find out more from the UN Global Compact perspective. So please, we'll share the slide deck after the session, so people can have a look at that for more information. And after that perfect segue, I barely need to do any introductions at all, but I will quickly. We're very pleased to have Jonas Bengtsson from Edge Environment, who is the CEO of the company and the founder. So Jonas has been operating in this space for quite a while. Edge is an Australian-based consultancy supporting businesses to develop and implement business-wide sustainability strategies. Jonas specialises in life cycle assessment. He works a lot with triple bottom line sustainability and environmental rating tools, has done a lot of work with certifications and climate change adaptation mitigation. So he's very well qualified to talk about the use of science-based targets. He also has a broadening empire going across into South America as well with Edge, and he's also had very significant involvement with organisations such as the Australian Life Cycle Assessment Society. He's a member of the Green Star Expert Reference Group for LCAs, a founder of the BPI Rating, and a vice chair of the Environmental Product Declarations Australia Technical Advisory Group. So a wealth of knowledge and experience there, and he's going to give us a little bit of background about how Australian businesses are adopting science-based targets and take us through some of the work that Edge has done in that space. So Jonas, over to you.
Thank you, Jane and Corinne. That was excellent. So just to kind of build on what Corinne was talking about, kind of give a map over current kind of more global picture of which companies are signed up. So yesterday there were about 895 companies that have either committed or had their targets approved through the Science-Based Target Initiative. And as you can see, Oceania, there's about 34 companies, of which 12 has approved targets, and some of them are really packaging related. Edge has helped about 20 companies on this list to either develop or get the targets approved, so across a range of different sectors. The kind of one going into technical level, the targets are almost always including the whole value chain. So for you familiar with carbon accounting, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emission sources. And that includes a challenge for many companies to kind of understand the supply chain emissions and the downstream kind of consumer-based emissions as well. So it's quite a holistic kind of scope, and looking, for example, at the supply chain, but also the use of sold products, which working, for example, in the development and property industry, that means that a Fraser's property of this world, for example, building apartments, they're responsible for, and it's included in their target, the emission from that apartment or that house for 60 years. So you really have to think through how the products that you sell are going to be contributing to the decarbonization of the world. So it's a really interesting challenge. Now, it's often overwhelming to think, how do I quantify and where should I focus? And as a rule of thumb, 80% of companies, they're going to end up with 80% of the emissions actually being outside their direct control, so the scope 3 emissions, and only 20% of the emissions are their scope 1 and 2, so the electricity they use and the fuel they use in their trucks, etc. So that's a typical picture that you need to think much wider than your own organization and address and develop targets that are quite holistic. For about 20% of the economy, typically the primary industries, that's where most of the emissions occur through their direct activities and doesn't sit so much in their supply chain. And looking at packaging, so this is a life cycle assessment snapshot of wine. And packaging can play a significant role in products like wine, for example, where it's up to a third of the total carbon footprint of the product, and maybe even more if you're factoring in the weight of packaging and volume of packaging and the role in transportation as well. So it can be really important. Packaging can be a really big component, and it would also fall in that, typically in that scope 3 category. This is another example in terms of looking at carbon from a packaging and food waste perspective. So it's really important to think holistically, as I mentioned before, that, all right, I know for example, what the carbon contribution is of my packaging here, but you need to think about it obviously from protecting the product inside and reducing food waste and optimize holistically. So for example, looking at the mushroom packaging here, that right, we need to get kind of eliminate the PVC film on top of the mushrooms, but if that starts to lead to higher food waste losses, whatever environmental and carbon savings might be negated through that process. I'll give you a local example. I think the best way to kind of get under the hood on science-based target is to look at an example, and this is not completely packaging related, but it is one of the early adopters on science-based targets, and one of the first ones to get their targets approved in the region. So it's Optus and Singtel. Optus is the second biggest telecommunication business in Australia, and together with Singtel, as a part of the 5th largest telecommunication business globally. And part of their strategy, one part of it is to reduce their footprint, and they work very actively with life cycle assessment and science-based targets to achieve those sustainability targets and sustainability strategy outcomes. And LCA, I'll show you a bit how LCA and SBTs are actually related. So a couple of years ago, probably 5-6 years ago, we started working with Optus and Singtel, and the question back then was around how do we understand what's material in terms of sustainability challenges? Can we quantify it? And we want to have that basis in terms of our sustainability reporting, and not so much based on stakeholder opinion or influence, but want to have it science-backed. So we did an organizational LCA of their operations, which includes the products that they buy, the phones and devices, modems, the networks that they operate, the retail space, and the headquarter and fleet and all that, and see where does the predominant emissions lie. And quickly it becomes one of the key challenges would be, well, we have about 10,000 suppliers and we spend about $10 billion on those suppliers every year. How do we quantify the carbon emissions in a meaningful way from that vast kind of global network? And there is a method, I won't go into it, but there is a method in terms of using recognized emission sources, emission factors, and an approach, life cycle approach to do that. But the starting point for any company with that type of footprint would be to start to prioritize and say, right, we need to focus and narrow down the scope a bit and look at the top 95% of spend rather than everything, and that immediately reduces the number of companies that they need to look at to 750 in this case. Most companies, they shortlist even further. And then to look at in what categories do we spend the most money, and where do we have the most suppliers. And for customer devices, there's a lot of spend, but only with a few companies, which would be your well-known electronics and mobile phone and device manufacturers. They spend on support and IT and fixed networks, but these are the key kind of spend categories. And the next step after that is to look at, from a geographical perspective, where are these suppliers based? So if they're in Southeast Asia or China, there would be a certain emission factor, emission intensity associated with, for example, producing electronics or network equipment. So you need to understand where in the world your supply chain lies and where the money flows, if you will. And then apply that emissions intensity in terms of where the production happens. And as Corinne mentioned before, a lot of these sustainability issues are quite interconnected. So it immediately lends yourself to think about, now that I'm looking at carbon intensity from my, say, Southeast Asia supply chain, what are the labor conditions with these suppliers as well, and start to look at a broader sustainability lens, which falls quite naturally from starting with in this case, a carbon focus. So putting together Singtel Optus carbon footprint, in terms of tons of carbon, it's quite significant. It adds up, their operations adds up to, I think it's around 1%, or close to 1% of Australia's national emissions. The footprint that I have there, and about, again, the 2080 rule that 20% is in direct energy to run the networks and the fixed and mobile network and the offices, and 80% is in the supply chain, of which mobile phones and customer support and network construction, travel adds up to big chunks. So to work in a meaningful way to reduce carbon and set targets, scope 3 and indirect emissions needs to be included. Drilling down even further and to see where in the supply chain, what are the issues in the supply chain that drives this carbon footprint. And common across the whole supply chain of all these thousands of different companies is energy is a really key component. Energy is, again, close to 80% of the emissions. So that already starts to give some indication of where to focus, not only focus on direct emissions, but also what the common issues are in their supply chain. So starting to look at what can be achieved by simply switching to renewable energy. If, say, Optus commits to using 50% renewable energy for their fixed and mobile networks and their offices, they can significantly reduce, just through that action, reduce their footprint. In their scope 3, so look at mobile phones, for example, different solutions, but say that we can extend the usage time of consumers, how long they use their iPhones and Galaxies. If they can, say, increase that from 18 months to 24 months, that could start to have a significant impact on a meaningful impact on the footprint, and then encourage their suppliers to also switch to renewable energy, can further drive down as immediate initiatives that they can drive. So science-based targets, they looked at the footprint, they looked at the feasibility of achieving the reduction that science-based targets the calculations indicated, and they committed to a 40% reduction from a baseline year of 2015 by 2030. And they decided to do their footprint, their target combined with direct and indirect emissions to give themselves the maximum flexibility on how they would meet that target. A lot of companies, as Corinne mentioned before, they split it up into value chain and direct emissions, but you have the choice to either aggregate or use it independently. After doing an organizational view, it makes sense to go in to look at product carbon footprint. And understand more what the opportunities are to reduce emissions and what specific initiatives might be. So as mentioned, the mobile phone and device aspect is a big part of the emissions for Singtel Optus. And Apple have done their homework. They've done assessments of the life cycle emissions of mobile phones, and realized that in the mobile phone, 80% is in the production of the hardware, and about 70% is in the consumer use in terms of recharging the phones for the use, for the life of the device. And that already gives them an idea about what do they need to focus on. So as an example of what Apple did was that they started the Supplier Clean Energy Program, where they wanted to drive renewable energy use and investment in their supply chain, and set a target of 4 gigawatt renewable energy supply chain in the supply chain by 2020, which they already exceeded ahead of time, and they thereby reduced the greenhouse gas intensity of the mobile phone through working with their supply chain. Another example of that, which has been around for a while, and this is again an international example, is Walmart, so the gigantic retailer. And they were one of the early ones to set science-based targets, and they've their commitment translated into reducing 1 billion tons in their supply chain, in their scope 3. So that was much more significant than what they can do with their own store and their own fleet. And they were wondering, how do we do this? They've been trying for many years to develop a sustainability index on a product level. But they ended up saying, well, actually, what's more meaningful is that we want suppliers to take meaningful action. So either they can do address one of the 6 kind of key categories that's at the top right, or simply tell us what your science-based or what your emission target is, preferably a science-based target. We will put that into our procurement platform, and we will count that towards our reduction target, and we will then have incentives and recognition for suppliers that have ambitious or science-based target and meet them year by year as they report on progress. So a very interesting model which has been adopted by Walmart, which is very inclusive and in a sense collaborative, which perhaps goes contradictory to a lot of other things here about Walmart. Mm-hmm. So the next one is I want to talk briefly about the circular economy as well. So a lot of the initiatives to drive down emissions once you set your targets will again broaden out to closing the loop on resources, as often those emission reductions and resource efficiencies or closing the loop go hand in hand. This is just a brief example of some of the initiatives that you can do from a circular economy perspective, where you have circular suppliers implement life cycle thinking. And I want to focus specifically and give just a quick one on product as a service, because I think that's a really fascinating approach and method to address carbon reductions. So I know this is not necessarily an interactive session, but I'll virtually ask you which flower arrangement is more circular and sustainable of the ones you see on the picture here. Pick your favorites. I'll give you a hint. One of them is a fresh arrangement. One of it is artificial, so plastic flowers. And the more circular and the more sustainable is the artificial by far. So if you look at resources to replace and maintain a fresh flower arrangement for 5 years, you end up using hundreds of times more flowers in order to be replaced at. And if you look at carbon savings, so the carbon invested in one of the artificial flower arrangements is about 80 times lower than what you achieve with fresh flower arrangements, where a lot of the flowers that we use are grown in other continents, air freighted over. We use a lot of fertilizers and irrigation and fuel to transport them. So there's significant savings in terms of that artificial flower arrangement. And the key here is to think about what is the actual service and not the product that we're offering, and rejig the business model accordingly. And one artificial arrangement has higher footprint than one fresh flower arrangement. But again, that quickly kind of, the return on that investment is quite quick when you start to look over an extended period of time. So this goes a bit counter in terms of what we think where, well, hey, wait a second, it's plastic and all that better than natural. But I think we need to start thinking more from that scientific lens often. And that's just one initiative. And a lot of companies, when they know what the footprint is, they worked out their targets, they know what they need to get to by 2025, 2030, etc. Then they list all the initiatives that they can do in their value chain with consumer engagement in their own operations, and start to put a cost to that. What's the return on investment in financial terms? Where should we start? Where's the low-hanging fruit? And develop a bit of what's called a marginal abatement cost curve, where it helps prioritize where to get the most beneficial carbon reductions. So to sum up quite quickly, and I think as Corinne was talking about, and as Peter will talk about later, this is a little bit of a new frontier on carbon management to work very strictly with agreed targets. But as you drill into it, you'll find lots of cost-effective mitigation potentials and lots of opportunities to think more broadly around product as a service, collaboration with supply chains, and collective bargaining power when you realize that you have a lot of common issues. And to link it to a wider set of objectives, you get much more benefit when you think, how can I connect this to the modern slavery requirements, then the sustainable procurement and the wider sustainable development goals. And a lot of you are thinking TCFD as well, in terms of a broader climate risk disclosure that you need to work on. All these things link quite well together. It was a really quick run through. I just want to do a quick plug for if you want to learn more about science-based targets. You can go to our website and jump on. It doesn't cost anything. It's about a 20-minute free kind of introductory module to science-based targets. There's a bit of a few kind of control questions along the way, but I recommend that. There's a lot of further resources and references that Corinne was mentioning before where you can find more information. So please feel free to use this resource. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great. I think that gives a really good picture of the fact that, you know, that there are an increasing number of tools and things emerging into the market at the moment, and you know, a lot of this stuff is underpinned by that carbon element. And I think if we think in that kind of context, all of these other elements slot together quite nicely, and provide a really good framework for looking at how we can improve things generally. Our last speaker today is Peter Shelley, who is Sustainability Manager for Energy and Carbon in the Customer Community Team at Australia Post. Peter, as I said, thank you very much for joining us at the last minute after a bit of a schedule change that happened yesterday. He has stepped in at very short notice. Peter's been Sustainability Manager at Australia Post since 2013, and he's been responsible for managing some very exciting projects during that time around things like the Carbon Disclosure Project and monitoring and managing obligations there, looking at carbon performance across the organisation, certification by Climate Active, working with the International Postal Corporation, and setting up Australia Post as a member of the Emissions Reduction Fund. Since 2014, Peter's led community and energy organisation Moreland Community Solar, working closely with the Australian Energy Foundation, so he has a very broad and diverse experience both at a professional and personal level. And it's with my pleasure that Peter is going to introduce Peter, who is going to give us a little bit of background about what Australia Post has been doing in the context of science-based targets. So Peter, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks everyone. And especially thanks to Corinne and Jonas for your comprehensive overview. I suppose we're always interested in what happens at big corporates like Australia Post and what are we thinking. And just to give you a little context about us, we're not quite as big as Optus, but we've got a carbon footprint of around 850,000 tonnes. And I know people always talk about tonnes, and I always say, well, what does that mean? So we either use passenger cars, so we reckon that's about the equivalent of 200,000 passenger cars, or more than 100,000 homes. So that's a big footprint. And of course, when we delve into the details a bit more, we can really see the impact that we have. So at Australia Post, we have more than 11,000 vehicles that we actually own ourselves. So there's clearly opportunity to look at ways that we can operate more sustainably in those different categories. But but recognizing that our large trucks actually contribute 88,000 tonnes to our footprint. So it's about 80% of our Scope 1 emissions. So we've got Scope 1 emissions at around 120,000. Then we have our properties for our Scope 2. We've got about 1,200 properties, of which we own between 250 and 300. And I'll speak to that a little later, but we've made significant reductions in our electricity usage. And I think that it's the commercial side that has been really important for us at Australia Post. And we hope to be able to continue that with our new targets. For our Scope 3, we have about 576,000 tonnes, and that's mainly made up of our third-party network. So we're slightly unique in the sense that we've got a particular reliance on our suppliers, but for services that they're providing directly to us, rather than the sort of through the supply chain that Jonas was describing. So we're a little bit unique, but you know, we've got, for example, 15 dedicated freighters moving everyone's parcels around, and in fact we had to increase that number from we only had 8 at one stage. So the volumes that have gone up over the past few months have been considerable. It isn't quite as bad as it seems from a carbon footprint point of view, because we actually no longer have access to the passenger freight that we were using, and over time that will change. But really, I suppose the important part that we think about the science-based target is that it really opens up this Scope 3 category, and getting us to work more effectively with our suppliers to understand what contribution they can make and what can we do to help support them so that they can become more sustainable. So one of the things that I thought I'd just touch on was our performance that we've achieved. So Australia Post had a target which was around Scope 1 and 2, and that was set in 2010. And it was a 25% reduction in absolute greenhouse gas emissions. So effectively year on year, 2.5% absolute reduction. Now we did start from a negative position, because we were actually at a higher position than our target, because our target was back at 2000 and we were in 2010 and we needed to achieve 28%. So that made things a little tough, but it came up with a nice round number. So it was basically 100,000 tonnes of carbon that we needed to reduce. And over that time, we were able to, so far, particularly in our energy efficiency, we've been able to take out 61 gigawatts of energy for our properties, and that's the equivalent of about 9,000 houses. So you know, that's pretty significant to us, and we're pretty proud of those achievements. Now, some of you may have seen we as part of other initiatives that we've had, we've introduced a 2 megawatt solar system, Sydney Pass facility. We've got 35,000 LED lights introduced at over 100 facilities this year. And in total, we now have more than 15,000 solar panels. So they've all helped us to reduce our footprint at a time when our parcel volumes have grown significantly. And one of the tricky parts of this process is that we now deliver to more than 1.4 million more delivery points than we did in 2010. So you get a sense of the scale. Now, Jonas talked a bit about the work people do on LCAs. We're actually part of the Climate Active program, and now offer carbon neutral deliveries for our card products, which we've had audited through the Climate Active program. And what it means is that we're able to provide customers with details around specific products and services that they procure through us, which would obviously help them as the scope in their Scope 3. So for all you people that are offering have Scope 3 services and require details of your freight, if you have a card product through us, that means that it actually becomes carbon neutral. So that's a good starting point for us. So I think that the real takeaway point from the Scope 3 and why it's important is that we can work with our partners. So we don't have to do it all by ourselves. You could, if you have a Scope 1 and 2 target, maybe you commit to renewable energy and you're able to achieve significant savings. But for organisations like us that are very reliant on our partners, we're going to have to look at ways that we can actually work collaboratively to deliver those savings. So I suppose we are at the science-based target, and you're saying, well, what does that actually mean for us? Well, at this time, we're in the committed group of companies. So we've committed to a target. We've worked out what we think our target should be, but we've yet to get it ratified by the SBT, and that's a process that we're going to go over the next 12 months. We do already have a commitment in our corporate responsibility plan that says that we want to achieve science-based reduction outcomes consistent with the program. And at the moment that we've been focused on the well below 2 degrees, but once we get into the program, I think there's great opportunities for organisations like us. And I thought I'd just close with an example of something that we have been able to achieve over the past 5 years. We had a tender where products were being moved from Brisbane to Darwin, and one of us on the road, and it went every day, and it was 7.5 million kilometres were travelled each year. And one of our suppliers said, you could actually do this a completely different way. You don't need to have a dedicated route from Brisbane to Darwin. What you can do is you can use your existing freight network to go from Brisbane to Sydney, from Sydney to Melbourne, then from Melbourne to Adelaide, and then you can put it on the train and you can go all the way up to Darwin. And that means that your carbon footprint is going to be significantly reduced. In our case, we worked it out at about 35,000 tonnes. So that was from one initiative servicing one route. And if there were other examples that we could fulfill along those lines, then we've got a great opportunity at Australia Post, and it's really exciting to be part of it. So I thought I'd end there.
Peter, that's a great way to wrap that up, actually. And it's interesting. I think you really hit on something that we at APCO are very much passionate about in terms of the packaging side of things as well, and that's the engagement along that supply chain. And you have those conversations with people that are very much interdependent on one another, but don't necessarily talk to each other, and all of a sudden synapses start connecting, and all those kind of brilliant thoughts come to life. So we've got a couple of moments. I have one question on my Q&A list here, and I'm going to open it up to all three of you. The question there is, when setting your targets for your share of carbon, are there any science-based models to show the value of regenerative design principles, assuming that not all companies are signed up and taking action? I don't know if anybody would have an answer to that question, or something we can take on notice for a little later.
I can do a quick one on that in terms of kind of building back to the Optus example. And one thing that they realized was around the data services that they provided, where they felt like if they could run the data warehouses and the communication systems, they could do it more efficiently than, for example, the banks running their own data centers and processing. So they took on the bank's scope 1 and 2 emissions from running their own data centers, took it on them as their direct emissions, and thereby kind of reducing the net emissions for the overall system. And I felt like that was a really good kind of selling point, that we'll take your carbon, we'll reduce it overall because we can do it more efficiently, and thereby offering better value to the customers. And I think it's similar to what Peter was talking about in terms of the offering carbon neutral services that you essentially help other companies reduce their emissions.
Yeah, absolutely. And Peter, I was very excited to see a carbon neutral delivery turn up at my front door yesterday. So I know exactly what you're talking about there. It's very exciting. I'm just going to move that.
I think that the only thing I was going to say on that, is, that Optus is obviously taking things on board. And I think that happens the same with things like Australia Post, that, we're in a position where if we take on services, then that can, and that we're able to influence the, and reduce, then that helps everybody. So, that's a good point.
Yeah. Look, folks, I'm very conscious of time. We've just hit the 3 o'clock mark. I don't think we have time for any more questions. To our audience, please, if you have other questions, feel free to email them through to us, and we will endeavour to answer them. I would just like to thank our 3 presenters this afternoon. I hope you found that conversation as interesting as I have. In terms of the relationship to packaging, they sit out there in that Scope 3 area, so I think there's an enormous relevance to the audience that we're talking to here today in the APCO membership and beyond that. So I'm hoping that that's given people a little bit of insight as to how these discussions might be becoming part of their world as time goes by. So thank you very much to all 3 of you, and to all the support team at APCO who get us up and running every week. Thanks to them as well. And thank you very much to our audience. It's been great to have you here today, and we hope you've enjoyed this session, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks everyone, have a great afternoon.
Thank you everyone.
Thank you.